Do you practice mindfulness of breathing? It's one of the standard kinds of ways we do meditation. And what I want to do in today's lecture is look at the second half of the Buddha's description of the practice of mindfulness of breathing from the early texts. I'm Doug Smith of the Online Dharma Institute, that's onlinedharma.org. If you're new to this channel and interested in living a wiser and a kinder and a calmer life, consider subscribing to this channel and click the bell down below if you want to receive notifications when I come out with new videos. So in our last video, we looked at the first part of this sutta on mindfulness of breathing, the first 8 steps out of 16. And just to recap a little bit, this sutta on mindfulness of breathing basically looks at the practice of mindfulness of breathing as coming out of, if you like, coming out of this idea of mindfulness practice generally. And mindfulness practice generally is in what's called 4 foundations of mindfulness: mindfulness of the body, mindfulness of feelings, that is feeling tones, positive and negative, positive and painful, pleasant and painful, I should say. The third is mindfulness of mind, and finally mindfulness of dharmas. And this fourfold structure is then reflected in the practice of mindfulness of breathing that we've been discussing. If you haven't seen that first lecture or that first video, I'll put a link to it down below. You can watch it after this one if you like. There's no reason, it doesn't really matter which order you watch these in. But in any event, today I'll be discussing the second half of this, the mindfulness of mind and mindfulness of dharmas reflected in breathing meditation. Before I get to that, though, I do want to say one thing which may be concerning you, you may have questions about, which has to do with whether we practice these 16 stages in order. Are we supposed to do them one after the other, or in some other way? And that's not entirely clear from the text, I should say. It doesn't really say, it doesn't give an answer to that question. Analayo, I should say that Analayo wrote a book about this practice, mindfulness of breathing, and that's where a lot of my own information about this comes from. He's done a very in-depth kind of study comparing the Pali and the Chinese and different versions of these texts to try to find what might be the sort of original text and how to understand these. Well, the way that Analayo looks at this is to say that we can do all of these 16 steps one after the other in a single meditation sitting. And so that's kind of how he frames this as we go through these one by one until we get to the end, until we've done all 16. Now, I mean, for my own sake, I would say that seems a very, very powerful practice. However, it's also a practice that's going to require us to have a certain amount of time. It's going to take quite a while, I think, to do these in order with any kind of thoroughness. So we have to have the time. I don't know exactly how much time it would take. In other words, it depends upon the person. But certainly, I would say a half an hour at the very least, and probably much more than that. We also need to have a very steady mind if we're going to do these in order, where we're really able to have a steady and a calm mind to be able to actually do these. When I go through them, I should say myself, I find myself circling back. In other words, some of the earlier practices will involve, let's say, calming the mind so that in a later practice we can investigate it to some extent. But if that calmness evaporates, as it tends to do for many of us, myself included, then we'll find that it may be better to go back a step, to sort of circle back and do the calming meditations again so that we can move forward. So we're going to find ourselves sort of moving back and forth in these, and that's at least how I find myself working with them. But I would suggest working with them however you find it most convenient and however you find it most fruitful. So with that out of the way, let's get to the practice. Today we're going to be looking first at the practice of mindfulness of breathing, looking at the mind. That's the first set of these 4 aspects of our practice today. And in our last lecture, we sort of left off where we were calming the mind. So that's sort of how we're getting to where we are. The mind has been calmed after looking at mindfulness of feelings for a while, and now with a calm mind we're turning to our next stage, where we're doing a practice of breathing in and out, experiencing the mind. That's going to be our 9th stage, or our 9th aspect here of mindfulness of breathing, is this breathing in and out, simply experiencing the mind. We do this while the mind is in a state of relative calm. We're trying just to sit with the mind, trying to sort of experience it, feel the character of the mind, feel how it changes from moment to moment. So we're simply spending some time with a calm mind, just simply looking at it. Having spent time with that, we then turn to our 10th stage in the practice, where we breathe in gladdening the mind and breathe out gladdening the mind. Now, this stage is kind of interesting in the sense that we've already seen in our last lecture a couple of stages of practicing with joy and practicing with happiness. And here we're practicing with gladness. So it seems like there's a certain amount of repetition here. And on the one hand, I don't think that that's incorrect. There is a kind of repetitive, we might say, spiraling nature to this practice, where we're coming back to the same kinds of experiences, but at a deeper level. So before, we were experiencing this joy and happiness simply because we had retired from the world. We were somewhat isolated from the world. We were simply in the present moment. We were leaving behind our ordinary cares and worries. Whereas in this stage, where we're gladdening the mind, I think we're at a deeper stage now. It's not simply that we're in the present moment and divorced from our normal worries, away from our normal worries, but rather that we're experiencing this gladness or practicing with this gladness based upon calm. So we've gotten ourselves to a stage of mental calm and mental awareness where we're practicing simply with producing gladness based upon a kind of mental placidity, a mental calm, which is going to be an even subtler kind of pleasant state than the joy and the happiness we saw before. This is going to be something really quite quiet, but nevertheless very, very pleasant. In our 11th step, we practice breathing in, concentrating the mind, and practice breathing out, concentrating the mind. And here, we shouldn't think of concentrating the mind in the sense of excluding stuff or stopping listening to a certain thing or stopping paying attention to something, but rather concentration in the sense of mental unification, in the sense of getting away from the ordinary, I should say, mental turmoil that we're normally in. So, but this, of course, at this point, we're talking about a very, very subtle form of mental turmoil because we've already concentrated the mind, we've gotten the gladness, but here we're simply resolving that somewhat by putting our efforts into unifying the mind even further. Having concentrated or unified the mind during this previous practice, we then turn to the 12th stage here, which is to practice breathing in and out, liberating the mind. And this is a very strong, or you might even say surprising kind of term here, because liberating the mind seems to imply that we're perhaps getting towards nirvana or awakening, enlightenment. That's not really the case here. We're quite a ways from that. But what we might be, it's not entirely clear, but Analio and certainly other people have also suggested that in this stage what we're talking about may be something more akin to what's called temporary liberation. Temporary liberation is one of the ways that sometimes jhana is discussed. Jhana is a stage, or stages, 4 stages of ever-deepening kind of concentrated meditation that involve the arising of very, very pleasant states of joy, happiness, and all kinds of other things up to equanimity. We're not going to get into those, but the point is that that might be what's implied here. We may be, this stage may be suggesting that here we're going to be breathing in and out, getting ourselves towards states of deep absorption, getting ourselves towards states of jhana, or similar states of the Brahmaviharas, such as these are states like loving kindness, compassion, sympathetic joy, and again, equanimity. In other words, there are a number of different possible ways we could take this stage in our practice of breathing meditation. However, if we're going off in those ways, if we're going from this 12 stage into jhana or into the Brahmaviharas, we're going to essentially be leaving behind breath meditation, at least for a time. Because if we're practicing jhana, we're no longer going to be following our breath. We'll be in jhanic states, and those don't involve the breath. At least they certainly wouldn't be on the first jhana. And if we're getting into the Brahmaviharas, that's also a sort of a separate practice. So there are many ways of understanding this. It may simply be that we're getting into a liberation, a temporary liberation, that simply is getting ourselves away from our ordinary greed and hatred and delusion in the way that jhana states are said to do. Perhaps we can also do that within a more normal state of mind while we're doing breath meditation. Anyway, there are different ways we can interpret this stage. All I'm saying is that it's not entirely clear how we're going to practice with this. The practice is being left open to us. How do we interpret it? Finally, we're going to be turning from mindfulness of mind, which we've just completed, that is to say the practice of breathing meditation that involves the mind, towards breathing meditation that involves dharmas. That's the fourth stage of the four foundations of mindfulness, which again is reflected here in a breathing practice. Now, this mindfulness of dharmas, what do we mean by that? It's again wide open to our interpretation, but many people many scholars have seen this to mean that basically what we're doing in this stage of our practice is really confronting the bedrock basic kinds of Buddhist concepts. We're bringing Buddhist Dharma really into our lives. We're really getting down to a deeper kind of encounter with the Dharma at this stage. We're really sort of finishing up our practice by integrating these dharmas into the way we see the world. I think that's probably the best way to look at it. So that said, our 13th stage here is to breathe in experiencing impermanence and to breathe out experiencing impermanence. The Pali word here can be translated either as experiencing impermanence or it can be translated as contemplating impermanence. And different translators will translate that word differently. For myself, I tend to think that experiencing is probably a better choice of words here because I think contemplating suggests that we're thinking about it. We're performing mental operations. We're sort of pondering impermanence. And I don't think that's really the point here. We're supposed to be simply seeing it, simply experiencing the impermanence in all of our life, in everything that is around us, in the whole world, in the world of our experience, if you like. Now, why is this, I think, important? In this stage here, we've already gone through a lot of concentration, a lot of unification of the mind. We've had a lot of very pleasant experiences. We saw joy, we saw happiness, we saw gladness, different words for basically similar kinds of experiences. And I think we're getting to really what is some of the most pleasant ways that we can live, the most pleasant experiences we can have. Jhanic experience are said to be, by the Buddha, the most pleasant experiences basically that are humanly possible. And the danger here is that we come to think of these as permanent states, that we come to think of these as the point of our practice, that we come to think of them as somehow essential, as somehow who we are, that we begin to reify them and cling to them as something that we have to attain, that is part of who we are. And these are all dangers. They're dangers from within a dharmic context, because everything is impermanent, everything passes away. All created dharmas pass away, all compound things come to an end. And so at this level, when we're coming to this 13th stage, this first stage in our contemplation of dharmas, we're seeing that all that we've already been through is impermanent, and therefore is dukkha, is unsatisfactory, is not something that we have to that we should want to cling to. And this leads to the 14th stage here, in which we breathe in, observing dispassion or fading away, and we breathe out, observing dispassion or fading away. Now, the word here is viraga. It can be translated either as dispassion or as fading away, and again, different translators will have different words here. My own preference would be for fading away. We're not really seeing the dispassion yet. That'll come. What we're seeing is the fading away of all things. We've already experienced impermanence, and impermanence involves essentially this idea that things will begin to fade away, that they will tail off, that they have an end to themselves. So we spend time in this stage of our practice simply observing things fade away. Let's say the breath, if the breath fades away after a time, that the in-breath fades away as it stops, that the out-breath fades away as it stops, and that all aspects of our experience also fade away. And that stage leads to our 15th stage, which is to breathe in, experiencing cessation, and to breathe out, experiencing or observing cessation. Again, here we're seeing a similar kind of thing. In the past, in the last stage, we were observing the fading away. Here we're observing the endings. We're paying attention to those last moments, if you like, or that last moment, insofar as we can really see it. And again, the breath itself, each in-breath has a cessation, each out-breath has a cessation. All things that we experience have cessations, they come to an end. That's what it is to be impermanent, to be changeable, to arise from causes and fade away from causes, all of these things that are so important to the idea of the Buddhist Dharma. Here we're trying to see it in each experience. And this experience of the cessation of all things then will lead, I think, naturally into our 16th and final stage here, which is to breathe in, experiencing letting go, and to breathe out, experiencing letting go. Whereas in our previous stage, we were looking at our experience and seeing how the experience ceases, how it fades away, how it ceases, how it's impermanent. These are what we've been going through. Now we're turning our attention inwards into our own emotional state, if you like, into our own states of volition, and seeing how when we come to an awareness of the ending of all things, the cessation of all things, this leads us naturally towards a letting go, because there's nothing anymore to hold on to. Things cease, things go away, and when they go away, there's nothing there to hold on to. So we naturally let go. This letting go, this ending of craving, this ending of attachment, is really the goal of all of Buddhist practice, getting ourselves towards, in the direction of a stage of global non-attachment to all things. Now, one thing that's important here is that we distinguish non-attachment in the way that we've been practicing it here from what's known as detachment. Detachment is a kind of not caring. Non-attachment, on the other hand, involves caring, but it's a caring that does not involve the ego anymore, where we're not ourselves involved as central beings with a permanent kind of self that is always going to be there, that grounds everything. Once we give up on that illusion, then we get to this stage of non-attachment. Now, I did an earlier video on this difference between non-attachment and detachment, which I think will be helpful as we resolve this whole idea of the practice of breathing meditation. And I'll put a link to that video up here on the screen if you want to watch it next. If you're getting something out of these videos, please consider checking out my Patreon page, supporting the channel, getting things in return. I'm sure you'll love it. Thanks so much, and we'll catch you on the next one.